Earlier on, we defined the responsibilities of a service as handle non-view logic, communicate with the server, and hold data and state. We also mentioned that services are a place where, in rare situations, we may do some DOM manipulation. Because this is such an unusual situation, we won't be considering it or looking at any examples in this course, and so I won't list it here. If you take a moment and look at these responsibilities, you'll see that there's very little that services aren't really responsible for. That means that identifying when we are not following good design guidelines with services can be a bit harder than with other objects. There's not a clear list of don'ts for services, only a list of do's. But even so, there are certainly some best practices around designing and writing services that, if we keep them in mind, will benefit us as we write our code. We're going to take a bit of a deep dive into services and how they are created by the Angular framework. So let's start that off by looking at creating a simple service in Angular. This is probably the way that most people would write a service. It's straightforward and makes sense. But what you might not realize is that there are several other ways to create a service, and for something like this, there are better ways to do it. In Angular, there are actually 5 ways to create a service, and we will cover them all today. The first and most straightforward way to create a service is using the value function. Let's look at a simple service using the value function. Now it sort of appears that the value function is for supplying primitives or simple values in services, like strings or numbers. But that's not really what value does. Looking at our old service, let's replicate it using value. You can see that this works as well as the service method, but it's even a little less code. What the value function does is create a service that is exactly what you passed into the value function. The next way to create a service is with the constant function. The constant function is essentially the same as the value function, except it's available during the app configuration phase. Looking at the usage and value of the constant function is beyond the scope of this course, so just know that it behaves nearly identically to the value function. The next function is the factory function. The factory function has to receive a function as its second parameter, and it executes that function, and then caches the result, and whatever is the result of that function is the value given back every time somebody asks for that service. The factory function is really what most people want when they create a service. So let's look at this one in action. So here we're getting a service that is exactly what we expect. So the factory function is simply just the normal way to create a service. The service function is a lot like the factory function with one difference. The service function will take the function you give it and call new on it. Then it will cache the result of that function and give you the result every time you ask for that service. Let's look at this in action. So what we're going to get up here is an instance of the class we created when we ask for that service. Now it is extremely important to realize that we are not getting a new instance every time we use that service. We are getting the same service. Let's see exactly what I mean. I'm going to create 2 services, reg1 and reg2. And each of those is going to depend on my registration service. And all I'm going to have them do is return that registration object. So now each of these 2 services is going to take the registration class, which is getting newed up by Angular, and then it's going to return out that object. So because each of these are dependencies of my controller, they're essentially bringing in the registration class twice. So let's just go out down here and console.log out whether or not registration 1 and registration 2 are the same instance. So you can see that those 2 objects are actually the same instance of the same object. So using Angular's service function, a class is newed up, but it's newed up only once. Now you may be asking why the difference between factory and service, and when would you use one over the other? Well, generally factory is going to be just fine. If you already have some classes that you want to use, or if you're using the new ES6 class syntax, then the service method makes sense. Besides that, you may find some edge cases where you need to use service, but generally factory is all you need. The last method we're going to look at is the provider function. This function is ultimately what all those other functions use under the covers. This allows you to create a service from a much lower level. What you have to do is give the provider function another function whose return value must have a $get function. Angular will call that function to create your service. As always, these are singletons, so we'll only call that $get method once, and then it will cache the result of that function. Let's see that in action. So the first thing I'll need to do is, instead of just being able to call app.provider, I actually have to call app.config. And then I pass in a function that has a parameter of $provide. This will ask Angular to give me the provide object, which has the provider function on it. So remember I said it has to return an object that has a $get function on it. And then now I can actually create my service. So let's go and run this in the browser and see what we get. Okay, so we're getting that service from our provider method. So now the big question is, why would you want to use the provider function? The benefit here is that using provider, you have the option to make your service configurable and configure it before it is created. So let's go down into our provider function, and in the object that's returned, in addition to the $get, let's add one more method called setType. So now you can see that I've added this setType method. If I want to use that setType method, I have to use the app.config function again, and I give it a function that takes in a parameter with a special format. This parameter, registration provider, is actually based on the name of the service I'm talking about, which is registration. Angular has created another object based on the registration object called the registration provider. This provider object is what is returned from this function right here. So therefore, it's going to be the object that has the setType method. So let's see that in the browser. So this is how I can make services that are configurable. Now it's important to remember that that $get function is only called once, so you can really only configure your service during the config phase of your application. Once you've actually used the service at runtime, you can't reconfigure it. Services are singletons, and there's no going back once the service has been constructed.